Thank you very much. I'm Yashodhan Ghorpade from the World Bank. Yeah. This paper that I'll be presenting today is a discussion paper that we've brought out at the World Bank, but I just want to clarify that the views presented here are mine. They are not necessarily those of the World Bank. It's an important disclaimer. But in this paper, I'm trying to look at the effects of cash transfers in particular on informally employed workers. So this is a review paper, but perhaps has some insights to offer to some of the topics we've been speaking about at this conference already. This is joint work with my two other collaborators, Camila Franco and Luis Eduardo Castellanos. And this was part of, this work came about as part of our engagement in Malaysia to advise the government on policies around informality. But in doing so, we thought it's best to understand what are the other approaches and the links with social assistance and social protection across the range of especially low and middle income countries to inform some of our advisory work. In this, I'll briefly talk about the scope of the review, the methodology we use for this review, share some of the findings along three dimensions on the impacts of social assistance or cash transfers, specifically on formalization, protection, and productivity of the informally employed. And in a minute, I'll come to how these may be it may be useful to think of them as distinct policy goals when working on informality, and then maybe some recommendations that can be generalized. But, maybe just as a starting point, there's often, an important distinction to make between the informal sector, which relates to enterprises and production units, and informal employment, which is more about workers. Now, there are, of course, many workers who are in both. So there are workers who are employed in informal sector units, but there is a bit of a Venn diagram here. Because we need to think about both the production units separately and the workers separately. There is a classification proposed by the ILO. I'm just producing this flowchart to help us think through how these are, how employment status is determined by this. But I'll come to what countries actually use to define informal employment in a minute. But going back to the objectives, when governments often talk about what do we do about informality, they may sometimes mean very different things. And it's important for us also to be clear about what is it that we're trying to achieve with the informal sector or those engaged in informal work. So one very important objective would be formalization. So, by that we mean essentially bringing workers into the fold of any kind of legislation or regulation, which typically would give them protection and classify them de facto as formal workers. So it's a bit sort of roundabout, but essentially formalization is about bringing workers into the fold of some sort of registration or national legislation. Registration or legislation for broadly the purposes of protection. But protection can be achieved in some cases outside of formalization too. So we think of protection in the standard sense as we do for social protection more broadly, which is enhancing the ability of people, in this case workers, to limit losses incurred due to shocks within and outside work through a combination of programs and policies. And here today I'll speak more about cash transfers as that's the theme of this session. And then a third objective many people may have is about recognizing, at least and maybe in the short term, a lot of workers may remain informally employed, but can we enhance their productivity? Can we, work with these workers to try and see they can move on to higher incomes? We make better use of their abilities. So this is really the standard labor economics definition of productivity, efficiency in the use of human resources. At the macro level, productivity would be measured by the volume of output produced per unit of labor. At the individual level, you would often proxy it through earnings of workers from labor. So these, I laid this out as three objectives that we often encounter when we talk about informality. They may be achieved simultaneously, but not necessarily always. The aim for programs and policies should be to try and see that we achieve all of them to the extent possible through common approaches, but while bearing in mind that action on only one may sometimes come at the cost of another objective. When we look at definitions, now, earlier what I provided was an ILO classification of how to think about informal employment. Then we went to what do countries, what are their definitions of informal employment? How is the national legislation framed around defining what is formal work, what is informal work? So there are typically, of course, definitions for formal work. And in most cases, including in lower middle income countries and LMICs and LICs, social security contributions, social security coverage, these are the top indicators. But interestingly to us, in many low-income countries, we also found that having access to paid annual leave was something that classified a worker as being formally employed. Some of these other indicators on the right-hand side, not so common. Sometimes these are used sort of in combination. So this is not a single indicator that is used as a definition. Oftentimes you may need a combination of characteristics for a kind of job to be classified as formal employment. But just putting this out there, that social insurance coverage is very much at the heart of defining or thinking of what is formal employment. Now, in our paper, we look at the areas of impact across formalization, workers' protection, and workers' productivity across a whole range of policies around social protection. So, there are some macro-level policies around economic growth, firm-level policies, and so on. But the focus in today's presentation is mainly on social assistance and cash transfer. These are non-contributory assistance programs, and we examine their effects on formalization, protection, and productivity, across different types of social assistance and cash transfer programs. But the paper that we have looks at some of these other policies and their evidence as well. We conducted a detailed literature review, which included some keyword searches. We looked at, apart from academic documents, also a lot of policy reports from development institutions and others. And then in some cases, we deliberately included some documents that we were alerted to or came across. We ended up with 118 quantitative studies, about 105 qual/mixed method studies. And, at the end, we have around 200 plus studies that we analyzed for this. But this is not all for cash transfers. This is for the fuller paper that we have. And our review is based on that. Some very quick, associations that we saw between country income levels and percentage of informality. The percentage of the informal workforce as the part of the total workforce is on the y-axis. We see the sort of gently negatively sloping line, slight nonlinearity here. But the informal employment essentially goes down as a country's income level goes up, per capita income level. Not so much of a relationship we found between GDP growth, so the growth rate of a country, and the change in informality between years. Slightly negative, but not as strong as we had expected earlier. And also on productivity, the share of informal employment is much higher in lower productivity economies. So productivity here, again, measured as GDP per employed worker. The first chart I showed you is GDP per capita. So there's somewhat similar graphs between the two, but just to be clear, we wanted to examine these separately. We, in our paper, summarize the findings across these three outcomes of interest by different kinds of policies. I'm just giving you this flavor to provide a flavor of the sort of main results. But I'll focus more on social protection programs, and in particular social assistance. To some extent also what we call economic inclusion programs, which is not pure cash, but cash plus programs, often with a graduation model. So in addition to cash, beneficiaries may receive skills training, asset transfers, some kinds of coaching, counseling, etc., what those effects are. But if I go now into first the effects of cash transfers on formalization. So you wouldn't immediately think of cash transfers as a way to formalize workers. But in many cases, there are concerns that providing cash assistance may retain incentives for people to remain informally employed. This is especially the case in high-income countries where cash transfers may discourage especially formal work, but sometimes also any work at all. This is especially the case in means-tested programs where, the minute you earn a single dollar of formal income, you lose all, assistance that you receive. To get around this, in many countries, there are income disregards, so you don't lose exactly $1 for every new dollar you make on the formal income in terms of formal income. But, there is more evidence of this or more of a concern of this in high-income countries. The evidence in the middle-income countries, there's a little bit, but much lesser in low-income countries. So we see some effects in particularly some Latin American countries, in Uruguay and Argentina, also some evidence of some disincentives from Ecuador and Turkey. But in some other countries, we found no such effects. So in particular, the Bolsa Familia program that so many have spoken about, previous studies have not found too many effects on disincentivizing formal work. But in some cases, and interestingly, there can be positive effects on formal employment through cash assistance in low-income countries. And how is that the case? That's because cash assistance to the poorest can sometimes relieve constraints on job search efforts. So people are able to look for and, obtain formal jobs. We had some examples earlier today of people using cash transfers to buy shoes for the job search efforts, for instance. In some cases, having access to cash transfers and some of the cash plus benefits can help establish linkages to formal market actors, so get involved in formal value chains, and this is particularly in the case of economic inclusion programs. So there is, I would imagine we wouldn't be too concerned about cash transfers disincentivizing typical cash transfers disincentivizing formal work in lower middle income countries. But just some notes from our review is perhaps if the cash transfer eligibility is linked to observed formal income, maybe you need to think about how this incentive works in reality. If the economy is highly formalized and incomes are more easily observed, then there is also, something to think about. And also, if the benefits are very high compared to, or rather the gap between the benefits and wages is low, then there is more of an incentive. But if wages are typically higher, much higher than cash benefits, you wouldn't expect as much as we see in our review. The next aspect, yes, I'll just summarize the effects of cash transfers on protection against shocks. So there is robust evidence of this across countries. Cash transfers are increasingly being used both for regular social protection and also during crises. They were overwhelmingly, as the right-hand side chart shows, they were overwhelmingly popular during the COVID pandemic across countries, including actually, especially in low and lower middle income countries or in economies with high informality, because the other means of providing assistance to workers through wage subsidies, for instance, or unemployment benefits would be less tenable in higher informality countries. So there is, a lot of evidence on the effects of cash transfers to provide insurance against shocks. But keep in mind there are also other programs that could do this. So public works of the kind that we've discussed today, the NREGA in India, for instance, but also school feeding programs, in-kind transfers where they are relevant can also play this role. So, here the takeaway for us would be that the choice of cash transfers for protection is quite clear. The case is made in many cases, but of course, think about how prevalent cash or mobile money is in the context, how well-functioning markets are, and there are still many contexts where there is a challenge at the last mile. Of course, there are macroeconomic considerations around inflation, etc., and also consider the viability of alternative instruments and based on the nature of the economy. Finally, on productivity, there is some concerns, mostly in the theoretical literature, about cash transfers reducing productivity. We haven't really seen too much of that, but in some cases, there could be also productivity enhancements because of cash transfers. So recipients may invest in assets or skills training which augment productivity. Sorry, I'll just take a minute to summarize. If cash transfers are conditional on job search efforts, that could enhance the labor market prospects. Cash transfers can relieve constraints on migration, so people can then migrate to access more productive, more remunerative work. And of course, there are intergenerational effects. So if children if people invest in children's nutrition and education, in the future, those children may end up becoming more productive individuals than if they didn't have access to those benefits. These effects are especially strong in the case of economic inclusion programs, but the mechanisms are, as one would imagine, through greater capital intensity, complementarity of skills, through market linkages, by providing the liquidity for investment, and in some cases by enhancing risk appetite, one can enhance productivity. So in the paper, we also talk about, based on the nature of formality of the economy, what may be the best combination of policies to achieve these objectives. I'll just quickly run through these and to say essentially that cash transfers are especially valuable for protection and productivity and pose lesser of a concern for formalization concerns in low and lower middle income countries. But of course, as with everything, contextual and the wider economic factors should determine the exact mix of policies. Thank you.